Welcome back, everybody. I thought I'd give you the dates for for the fall.
Is today the 21st?
Today is the day the world's going to end, the 21st.
Yeah. 9 p.m. tonight?
No, it's at 9 p.m., so we got...
Okay, the day today.
We have 12 hours left.
Yeah. We could, yeah. I like your weight.
September the 10th. September 24. October 8. October 22. November 5. November 19. December 3rd. And December 17th. Want to repeat that, or you okay? And for those of you who join midship, $68 for the 4 meetings. At your leisure. Okay? Quick review. The big thing last time was the difference between a subjective and an objective interpretation. When you got a dream figure, do you say, what am I projecting onto that person? Or do you say the dream is about that person? There is no rule. It is one of the hardest parts of dream interpretation. There are tons of rules of thumb. I don't think any of them really work. For me, the best thing is try it both ways and see what feels right. We talked about possession and loss of soul. And then we started a new chapter where we talked about the 5 steps in the withdrawal of projections in Greek religion. She starts there because that's more obvious. We don't have a problem to say, well, Zeus would represent power. Aphrodite would represent Eros. Saturn would represent depression and things like that. So we have come to a spot in the development of our consciousness where we have withdrawn projections that the Greeks once made. And then she went through the steps of the Greeks in that process of withdrawing the projections. 2 things then we're left with. One, we'll come back to again and again. This shift between the 4th and the 5th stages in the withdrawal of projections. Namely, the 4th stage says, well, that was a projection. What I was projecting doesn't exist. That was just something I made up. 5th stage is, I was projecting something, and I need to find it internally. What I was projecting may not be true on the literal level, but it is true on some other symbolic level. Now, that, again, is not so bizarre when we talk about our personal projections or the Greek religious projections, but it does become very thorny when you start talking about our projections onto God. That's where she goes to then in the next section, looking at what we've talked about in terms of Christianity. There are 2 camps that Jung irritates in this. One is the atheists, and certain Jungian analysts, such as James Hillman, who says, well, this idea of a centrally important value is an anachronism. There is no such thing. The psyche is polytheistic. It's not monotheistic. So the atheistic and the postmodern critique of Jung is he's making this central self up. It doesn't really exist. It's a holdover from Christian thinking. That's one side that doesn't like what he's going to say. The other side doesn't like what he's going to say are people who believe. Most, if you take this argument to CTS, you're going to run into trouble. That God is a projection, or that we project onto God. So what Jung is doing is saying, yes, just like we project Just like the Greeks projected onto Zeus and Hermes, just like we project onto each other, we also project onto God. That doesn't mean God is only a projection, but we need to understand that our relationship to God is as much based in projection as anything else. What she does in the chapter now, because it is something that Jung's been attacked for quite a bit over the years, particularly from the theological side more than anything else, is show, this idea of withdrawing projections from God isn't so new. You can actually see some of the most respected theologians in the history of Christianity doing the same thing. That's what she does in the last part of this chapter, to kind of show that Jung is not way out in left field, that he's really part of a tradition. That's not hard, and we'll look at it today. But because it touches on issues which have been so inflammatory, I thought we would go look at the material I sent you from Jung's work that lays out, I have a copy for you, that lays out the basic argument. That's not so hard, but all the implications. So I thought we'd spend the first hour looking at the implications of this very simple argument, and then in the last part we'll look at the projections being withdrawn from Christianity within the tradition itself. So Jung's basic argument on first page is that God is an image of a psychological part of ourselves. Later we'll see, of course, that's the self. So here's what he writes. If I assume God is absolute and beyond all human experiences, he leaves me cold. I do not affect him, nor does he affect me. But if I know that God is a powerful impulse in my soul, that's the key thing. So the theologian would say, well, you're psychologizing God. God is God. What do you mean he's an impulse in your soul? And the atheistic side would say, well, you're just needing to resuscitate an idea which should be dead long ago. But what that ignores is that what we have projected is also part of ourselves. Remember that. That's the fourth to the fifth stage. At once I must concern myself with him, for then he can become important, even horribly so, and can affect me in practical ways, which sounds horribly banal, like everything else that is real. So basic argument, which we'll now be looking at the implications of, is that God is a representation of an impulse in ourselves. He will clarify that, to be sure, but that's the starting point. So in other words, if you dream of a God image, you dream of God, you dream of Christ, which is not unusual, unless you are a believer, in which case you probably wouldn't be in Jungian analysis, then we would say, well, what is the inner Christ? What does that Christ figure symbolize in yourself? And it would probably be an image of your identity. That's how we would handle it. These first quotes just keep repeating his basic psychological argument. I'm not addressing myself to the happy possessors of faith, but to those many people for whom the light has gone out, the mystery faded, and God is dead. For most of them, there's no going back, and one does not know either whether going back is always the better way. To gain an understanding of religious matters, probably all that is left us today is the psychological approach. That is why I take these thought forms that have become historically fixed, try to melt them down again, and, now here's the loaded phrase, pour them into molds of immediate experience. So if you dream of Mary, if you dream of a crucifixion, if you dream of Elijah, like we talked yesterday, we would say, now what part of you is that symbolizing? But immediate experience, he takes it out of the metaphysical and tries to locate it as images within us. Inasmuch as religious, must be religion. inasmuch as religion has a very important psychological aspect, I deal with it from a purely empirical point of view. That is, I restrict myself to the observation of phenomena, and I eschew any metaphysical or philosophical considerations. I do not deny the validity of these other considerations, but I cannot claim to be competent to apply them correctly. So he's saying this is now a transition to the argument getting a little more complicated. He's saying, I'm not denying that there is a God. How would I know? If I base my criteria on science, I can't say I believe in God or I have faith in God. I have to base what I'm saying on experience. But it could be that there is an objective metaphysical reality that corresponds to that experience. I just don't know what it is, so I'm sticking with the experience of the thing. Whether there is an objective God or not, I don't know. And really, I have had people, basically scream at me, wanting me to say, but isn't this Christ? How would I know? That's my answer. And it's amazing how people have gotten furious just over that point. And you can see then it's a projection. How much is invested in that external reality? We're just saying the same thing now in different ways. God is merely a statement of an overwhelming fact. There are parts of my psychical system which overwhelm me at times. Same thing as the impulse. And those of you who did visions might remember this. For the animal is the God. Meaning that what Jung finds centrally important is the onslaught of instinct. And it's in the middle of the onslaught of instinct that we often find these images of divinity. These images come up not when life is going along smoothly, but when life has become chaotic, either by an onslaught of sexual desire or negative feelings up to hatred. That's one of the key features of Jung's work, that these images come in times of severe emotional distress. So he's breaking down this whole split between spirit and nature. Now comes the fine-tuning. God, therefore, is in the first place. So he's changed his argument to a slight, to more subtlety. A mental image equipped with instinctual numinosity, that is, an emotional value bestowing the characteristic autonomy of the affect on the image. Does that sentence make sense? In other words, it's a highly charged experience, which has got an archetypal image behind it. So emotion, desire, and images of divinity all go together in dreams. There are those who assume that when I speak of the God image, I mean that God does not exist, as he is only an image. So, what Jung is interested in is the experience that shows up designated as God. He's not saying that God is nothing but that experience, but that is what he can work with. And he doesn't then examine the metaphysical ramifications of that experience, but the psychological manifestations of that experience. Does that make sense? It doesn't matter whether God exists or not. It's what is the nature of your experience designated by God, and what does that mean internally?
It makes me wonder if, I don't know if I can say it, when Jesus was here, historical Jesus, that he was trying to tell us this, but people then projected onto him that it was him instead of everyone.
I personally feel, and we'll get more into this as we go on this first hour, Jung is carrying Christianity forward. Or you could say, Jung is going back and examining what the real foundation of Christianity is, personally. I think it's such an irony that where he meets the most resistance is from the Christian tradition. Yeah. It doesn't speak well for the Christian tradition. Which is why, he had that dream with that vision of God pooping on the church and destroying it. Okay, what we say about God is made up of our own psychology. That's the same thing. And you can see with sentences like that, he does kind of set himself up for the accusation of psychologizing. But if you read further, you will see he says other things that just because we say that of God doesn't, in his mind, mean that's all God is. He doesn't spell that out here. He kind of just throws these things out. Now comes one of the big controversies in history of psychoanalysis, I guess you could say. That Martin Buber took great offense at Jung's comments and accused him of psychologizing. And just what I said, and we'll look at some of the things Buber said about Jung, and then we'll look at something that Joseph Campbell said about Martin Buber. Buber, if you don't know, was probably the most articulate and in many ways beautiful theologian of Judaism. I think he taught Judaic studies in Frankfurt, I believe. He was a rabbi. And his book is I and Thou, which actually it's a beautiful book. I bet you I've read it 20 times. It's really an inspired piece. And you might say what he does is he looks at intimacy as the vessel for the sacred. In fact, Jung drew quite a bit from him. Jung's work on transference draws a lot from Buber. But Buber really took offense at what he felt was Jung's psychologizing God. And let's look at what he said and then Jung's response, and it adds another layer of fine-tuning to this argument. By the way, I took a lot of this from this book, if you don't know it. It's really great. The New God Image by Edinger. A lot of what Jung says is contained in his last letters, volume 2 of his letters. And it is really murder to try to understand. I gave up on it several times. What Edinger has done is gone through those letters and organized the themes and explained them. So a lot of what I'm doing is from this book. And this book is an explanation of Jung's last letters, and Jung's last letters hold Jung's late theological ideas. Volume 2 in the collected letters. So this is from a letter. Many thanks for your friendly letter, which shows that the Buber-Jung controversy is a serious matter to you. And so, indeed it is, for here that threshold which separates two epochs plays the principal role. I mean by that threshold, here's the key thing, the theory of knowledge whose starting point is Kant. So Jung's religious views are based on Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher. I think he was 18th century, late 1700s. On that threshold, minds go their separate ways, those who've understood Kant and the others that cannot follow him. Now, what did Kant have to say? Kant's position is there's no such thing as metaphysical knowledge. He distinguishes between metaphysical knowledge and metaphysical experience. So you can see this little bit of projection, how it is now mushrooming into this huge theological debate. That's why I wanted to spend some time on it. In other words, Kant doesn't disagree that there can be such a thing as religious experience. But his position is that doesn't necessarily mean that our experience of God is an accurate perception of God. So he distinguishes between experience of God and knowledge of God. And his argument goes something like, just like an ant can't know me. And that is a relation between the very small to the large. How can I, the finite, know the infinite? That's the basic argument. So that what we see of God in our experience is just that. It is not knowledge of the thing, it's experience of the thing. And that experience is conditioned by my perceptive organs that are having that experience. So, religious experience tells us more about me than it does about God. Does that make sense? Because I have this experience as a human being, that experience is shaped by the nature of me who's perceiving it. And it's my perceptive categories that are creating this experience. So by examining the nature of accounts of religious experience, what we're seeing is the psychology of the person who is seeing God. Therefore, there is no objective statements of God. There are only subjective statements of God, and those subjective statements are conditioned by the psychology of the subject. So that all religious experience is psychology. Or the descriptions of religious experience are records of the psyche of the person who saw God. Therefore, open psychological analysis.
So he really started the whole thing about this, that our psychology is expressed in our experiences of our God image.
Exactly. Right. What we experience of God is at least a record of our personal structures that have received that experience. And the experiences that we say are of God are actually shaped by our own inner images that have received that experience. Namely, in this case, the self. So, in withdrawing projections from God, what we are left with is our own structures that have perceived God.
You think we're born with those structures?
Yes, I do. Mm-hmm.
So that if you put everybody in the world together, you might get a closer image of God, but ours would just be the ant size.
Right. Everybody's got an ant's view of God. Yeah. And you can see, you've anticipated where we're going. I think the beauty of this is it opens the door for real ecumenical dialogue. Nobody can say, God told me to do it. You have to say, my experience of God is that I was told to do it. Well, I think some of you heard me say this. Think of the Iraq War. Everybody says, God told me to do it. Bush said that. Tony Blair said that. And they found diaries of the fleeing Al-Qaeda in which there were dreams recorded, Allah said, destroy America. And once you say, God told me to do it, dialogue stops. Because God is right. But this opens up opens us up to dialogue because that's their experience of God. And then there's my experience of God. Why is it so different? That's the step in consciousness that I think awaits us, to see how our view of what we feel is absolutely right is subjectively conditioned. And then that opens the door to dialogue.
I was just thinking, with Barb's comment, it said that Young is bringing Christianity forward by reinterpreting Christ. Oh, that little guy wants in.
What is it?
It's a chipmunk.
Oh, Charlie?
He keeps looking in on you.
Oh, yeah.
Around down there. I think he wants in. It's a union.
He might be.
Yes.
I've learned chipmunk talk. They got different chirps, and I've learned kind of. Yesterday he was chirping like, man, I thought, that is a different chirp. I looked outside, there was a cat.
Oh.
So he was warning his fellow chipmunks. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
So your chipmunk interrupted you.
Oh, yeah.
That may have been a divine intervention.
Singing animals of God's coming.
Yeah. Yeah, for a Native American, that would not be a strange thought.
Yeah. I was just thinking, well, it would be neat if there would be a person who would explore Islam and start reinterpreting.
I think there are.
Are there?
Yeah. I don't know, John, if you know what this dialogue is about, but I certainly have met Muslims who, what we forget is we got Billy Graham, we got Paul Tillich. Well, they have their Billy Grahams and their Paul Tillichs. And I think there are possibilities of open dialogue, but not on the fundamentalist side.
Yeah, I think they just began with the Germans started doing in the 19th century with the historical analysis of their sacred text and viewing it as a found object that was created by people as opposed to the divine word of God, and so bringing scientific analysis there on the actual text itself to discover places where certain statements were erased or ignored, for example, and others disputed the meaning of certain scriptural texts that are taken as fundamental, may not be so fundamental after all. And so it's a new discipline. It's a new dialogue. There was just a conference at Notre Dame on that. I can't remember the name of the fellow who leads it, but he goes under an assumed name in order to protect himself from people, fundamentalists who would kill him for working for him. I think his name might be Ibn Warwick, but I can't.
Is he Anglo or is he?
I don't know. I've never met him or seen him. I think he's written a book called Why Not a Muslim, based on Bertrand Russell's.
I see.
Christian. And he's one of the leaders in this reinterpretation of the script. There's that dialogue.
Yeah. One of my French teachers was Jewish, and she said in France she had many Muslim friends, and their dialogue was, how can we stop killing each other? This is not in any official way, but I think it's slowly starting. And just, you mentioned the violence. Some of you know Louise Motti, who's now, of course, slowly deteriorating out of consciousness, but she was at a conference where, who's the scholar? Elaine Pagels was scheduled, and Elaine didn't show up because of death threats. Just by examining Gnosticism, which is a Christian sect. It's incredible, the hatred that comes out when you challenge these projections. It's phenomenal. I think another good quote, which again fine-tunes the blatant psychological statements Jung makes, is the next one. I can also confirm I regard all declarations of faith as object of psychological research. That's what I was saying, that he sees religious experience as psychological experience, not as religious knowledge. Since they are subjective human statements about actual experiences whose real nature cannot be fathomed by man in any case. And the italicized is the important again. These experiences contain a real mystery, but statements about them don't. Now here comes Buber. Jung oversteps with sovereign license the boundaries of psychology. Meaning it's not up to us to interpret these experiences psychologically. They are metaphysically real and they mean what they say. And then Buber, again, another quote, psychology becomes here the only admissible metaphysic. Although the new psychology protests that it is no worldview but a science, it proclaims the new religious, the only one which can still be true, the religion of pure psychic eminence. So he's saying, Jung dismisses the existence of the metaphysical, which is not true, but he is correct that Jung interprets religious experience purely psychologically, and that is all we can say. That's what they don't like Jung saying.
Seems strange to me that a Jewish cleric would have such a problem with interpreting these statements psychologically, because the Nazi idea was also that they were ordained by God to rid the world of those who are inferior.
Well, wait, it gets worse. We'll see. It's tragic, I think. It comes up in the next quote after next. A little bit more on Jung's defense now. However interesting or enthralling metaphysical statements may be, I must still criticize them as anthropomorphisms. Does that make sense? Anthropomorphisms. That means that it is the nature of the human being to experience what it can't understand by recasting the experience in a human framework. So that we see God as a big human being. We see the mother of Christ as a big human being. That is an anthropomorphism. And if God is infinite, then how can God be a person? Yet we perceive God as a person. That's one of the things that leads Jung to say religious experience is psychological.
We recast things we don't understand in a human experience.
In a way, so like the ant would see us as a super ant, and we see God as a super person. But that is our shaping the experience for Jung's point of view.
It would seem like we have to do that in order to have any concept.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do what you can.
Right. So Jung is not saying that's wrong. It's just that's another example of how we subjectifize our experience, and then we believe in an old man in a beard, or we create it in our own image, and then we believe in it. But that's all. That says nothing about God. That says about how we perceive. Now, Buber, to your point here. I came across this in one of Joseph Campbell's videos. And so this is Campbell speaking. There is the brief but interesting dialogue I had with Martin Buber when he was in New York in 1954. He was lecturing in Columbia, and I raised my hand and said, "There's a word being used here this evening that I don't understand." He said, "What's the word?" I said, "God." "You don't understand what God means," he replied. I said, "I don't know what you mean by God. You've told us that God has hidden his face, that we are in exile." That's one of Buber's points. Not that God is dead, but that God has hid himself. I've just come from India, where people are experiencing God all the time. And you know what Buber said? "Do you mean to compare?" See the arrogance. We'll see, that's what Jung calls identifying with your subjective experience. So, for my taste, that shows the arrogance of the people who criticize Jung for subjectivizing religious experience. Because what they're really saying is, my religious experience is the only true experience. And you are inserting doubt into that.
So he meant to say, do you mean to compare the Indians' God experiences with ours?
Yeah, Yahweh is Yahweh, and you're trying to say that Krishna is the same as Yahweh? And Campbell says, yes. Yes, I am. Exactly. But, of course, these people think their experience of God is God, and that everyone else is inferior to it. How in the world will you ever have a world of peace with that attitude? And that's the attitude that is attacking Jung as being irreligious.
You know, you could really see, I think they could see why people are so terrified, because it's, you know, like if you have to change your point of view, then you're in this chaos.
Exactly.
I mean, if he wants to go to back.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that W.H. Auden poem, it says, "We would rather be ruined than changed. We would rather die in our dread than climb the cross of the present moment and let our illusions die."
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
He must have been a Jung fan as well. No, I'm serious. I'm serious. There's a wonderful book called The Lady of the Hair. It's the record of a seminar given by a British Jungian who wrote Stone Metamolecula, John Layard. Layard was an anthropologist and a Jungian analyst. And he gave a seminar in Oxford, I think, back in the 30s maybe. And he lists who was present and by initials, and one of them is W.H.A. So I think Auden must have been, as Eliot was, I mean, at least interested in these ideas.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it's sort of describing projection. Right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, because another way of saying that is we'd rather die than withdraw our projections.
Right.
Yeah.
Or kill somebody else.
Or kill somebody else. It's a lot easier.
But how much of this is tied into the idea that our projection really is because we want that father figure or that you know what I mean? Because otherwise you're an orphan without that, and it goes to kind of your feeling. Is that part of what you're thinking?
Well, it's the difference between Freud and Jung. Freud would say what you're projecting is your father onto God. And Jung is saying maybe, but really the deeper source of the projection is not a personal, but an impersonal part of ourselves, which is the self. So what we're getting to eventually is what is being projected is the self. I think you can see people who are, addicted to one interpretation of God are generally very intolerant of other interpretations. A way of saying that is they're intolerant of individuality because they projected it. So what is projected in Jung's point of view is individuality. That's what we disown when we project onto God.
It is interesting how some people can tolerate doubt.
Yeah.
And some can't. I think that's kind of fascinating. I guess it's tied with security or I don't know.
Yes.
Consciousness.
And this,
I think people tolerate doubt in different places. I think some people who are, they're okay with different religions, but you give them that work and something's worked for them in the past. What keeps running through my mind is just different things at work where something has worked in the past. It's clearly not working anymore. And yet we have to keep doing it because we are going to do it. And it's like we're going to fire everybody if you don't do this. Okay, it's dumb, but we'll do it.
the resistance.
The resistance to change of something that has worked in the past.
Mm-hmm. And not realizing that the demands of the present are different than the demands of the past. Mm-hmm. Okay, well that's the basic argument. Now let's look at what that means for life. I'll just try to touch on the main points. My human limitation does not permit me to assert that I know God. Hence, I cannot but regard all assertions about God as relative because subjectively conditioned. That's what we've been saying. And out of respect for my brothers whose other conceptions and beliefs has as much to justify them as mine. So what I love about it, he's opened the door to ecumenical understanding. You asked why. I think why it's so difficult to withdraw these projections is that it changes our understanding of what devotion is. If you have not withdrawn your projection onto God, you will be in the following position. Let's look at the next quote, a new responsibility. So the reason I think, part of the reason at least, is that if we withdraw our projections from God, we have to assume a new responsibility. The significance of man is enhanced by the incarnation. By incarnation here he means finding the inner God image as opposed to projecting God. We have become participants of the divine life, and we have to assume a new responsibility. Skip down to right above the italics. Man's relation to God. Here I am. Man's relation to God probably has to undergo a certain important change. Instead of the propitiating praise to an unpredictable king, projection, or the child's prayer to a loving father, projection, the responsible living and fulfilling of the divine will in us will be our form of worship and commerce with God. So in other words, the religious task becomes not worshiping God, but serving the God image within.
But there's a mentality that's fulfilling the divine will of God in us, that's shown in the bushes of the world and in the Iraqi soldiers that thought God was telling them to kill them.
Yes, though of course it's a projection.
Right.
And from Jung's point of view. And the what Jung is trying to get at is looking at what the God image is actually doing in your dreams and then being willing to dialogue with it.
I think that the important word is responsible in that sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
As opposed to just,
right.
taking
It's also
what you're given and just like acting it out. So,
It's a level of consciousness that they have.
Right. So, if God would, if I had a dream of God telling me to kill somebody, I'd have to say, no, wait a minute. What about these 10 commandments? See, that's the dialogue that doesn't occur. And maybe then I'd have to say, on what level am I to kill them? Do they have too much influence on me? Should I kill that influence within myself? And so on. But the working with the experience doesn't occur.
Really, it's the courage to have a conflict with an authority figure.
Exactly.
And that willingness to get into a conflict.
Very well said. Absolutely.
Is the key, I think.
Right.
Right. I wonder if the litmus test is if it's a popular decision, then it must be wrong.
That is very close. I really, this gets into how we see numbers, but I remember once when Ann McGuire was here years ago, there was this physician, English physician, some of you know and I've talked about with others. Yeah, skin disease. She had a small group show up, and the group was kind of obnoxious. But I said to her, "Gosh, I wish there would have been more people here." And she said, if there was a large group, it just shows you it's wrong." I thought that was very. That may be a little extreme, but we certainly are so eager to judge quality and quantity. I certainly always feel better if there's a large group. But like last night, it was a fantastic discussion. And you have a large group, you have more jerks, and it often kills the discussion. So yeah, I think that's, it can be overdone, but it's also something to remember. Quantity doesn't equal quality.
And that, just being willing to be in conflict with your dream figures. That's something you taught me that's like, I don't know, I've been in analysis once, but that wasn't something that one taught, is to be in conflict with and question your dream figures, what they say.
Yeah.
And open up to a new interpretation. Rather than passively, I think a child passively,
right.
Okay, I'll do it.
Yeah.
And especially if you're a pleaser. Huh?
I said, don't rub it in.
Oh, no, that's
Well, even with Young's challenging Salome and his dream,
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I never heard Bobby say in that class, but even when she's sitting there saying, I love you, it's just like, oh no, wait a minute.
Well, I didn't get into it so much, but in the dialogue, she says, "You're God, or you're Christ."
Oh.
He says, "You're crazy."
Oh.
Yeah. But can you imagine, in the Bible, anyone saying to Yahweh, "You're crazy," or maybe possible in the Jewish tradition, somewhat, but certainly not in the Christian tradition.
Well, and your other question, do you interpret that dream symbolically, concretely?
Mm-hmm.
On what level am I supposed to kill my brother?
Mm-hmm.
Those questions, that really need to be asked.
Yeah.
I was thinking of one of the things I read in one of Daryl Sharp's books. I think he was talking about from Boa, that he had a dream about Marie Louise von Franz when he was in an analysis with her, and she turned into an eagle, and he wanted to shoot the eagle, and he was very upset because he thought, in his active imagination, he shouldn't shoot the eagle in active imagination if he wouldn't, do it in real life. So he went to her, and she said, "Oh, that's my animal. Let's go ahead and shoot it."
Great story.
She had one. I'll just touch on some of the main points for the sake of time. You can go back and read it if you want. Skip down to "You seem to be interested." This is a letter to Arvind Sabata, who actually was in Chicago for a while. And he apparently written a letter to Jung extolling Jung as the great master. And Jung wrote back several things, but this is part of it. "You seem to be interested in how to get back to the self instead of looking for what the self wants you to do in the world." That's the shift in consciousness that is at issue here. Once you withdraw the projection, you've got the thing in yourself, and then you have to serve it. How can we go wrong here? That's on page 4. Of course, if one is not contained in this is Edinger talking, in a particular dogmatic creed, then that opens up the whole opportunity for experience of the reality of the psyche. I think this is that North Carolina group that I was working with, and we find not a few people who try to stay in that borderline interim position and have the best of both worlds. They dabble with psychology and still think that they don't have to relinquish the comfort that the religious containment offers. By religious containment, that would mean not seeing the experience as subjective, but seeing it as objectively true. But that's compartment psychology in which the right hand is not allowed to know what the left hand is doing. If analysis is going to have any real effect, those two sides have to be introduced to each other, and then, as Jung says, the person is in the frying pan. And then another one, there's no such thing as depth psychology as long as one is contained in the church. I'd like to say that to all these pastoral counselors. As long as the collective unconscious is bound, so to speak, to the symbolism of a concrete, particular religious dogmatic structure, there's no possibility of experiencing it empirically and individually. So there's no depth psychology for those who are contained within a specific religious creed. And I couldn't resist putting in the next quote by one of the big voices in Jungian psychology, who is exactly in that position of dabbling with psychology on the one hand and theology on the other. I think you'll see the error of her statement. The question of the relation of depth psychology and theology must include the perception that there is no basis for conflict or mutual negation because there is no precise common ground. The respective points of view shape their methods, attitudes, tasks, materials, and images of truth differently. Exactly the opposite of what Jung is saying.
So she's compartmentalizing.
Absolute compartmentalizing. And she's one of the big names in my field.
Mm-hmm.
She's even been here, I think. And
I saw her in Cincinnati.
did you? Uh-huh.
I read her book that was The Witch and the Clown. And it's really intellectual.
Is it?
Yeah.
Where does this leave us? Now, and this is really why I went through all this to get to this quote here in bold. The subjective stage of religious thought is always the interpretation on the subjective stage. There are worlds in that sentence. Anyone want to try it? The interpretation on the subjective stage would be withdrawing a projection. So that for Jung now, Yahweh, Christ, so on, can be seen as inner figures. What that does, it demythologizes the mystery. But that then sets the stage for another revelation. So that's kind of why I said I think Jung is really in the, I don't know if it's in Christianity necessarily only, but in evolving religious consciousness, that the old symbols for more and more people aren't objects of belief. So they withdraw a projection. That's the fourth stage. The fifth stage is finding what was projected onto those things inside.